some of you probably just know because I've just told you I'm Sylvia MacDonald. Thanks for coming and spending some time with me to hear about my experiences of improving the non-tech side of continuous delivery. For the benefit of those who've just come in, a little bit about me. So I'm at the moment a freelance agile and quality coach. Prior to this, I've been a developer, an exploratory tester, an unofficial scrum master, and an engineering manager at New Voice Media, most recently at which is a cloud-based SaaS company with customers globally around the world. And today I want to share with you some of the work I did a few years ago on improving our release processes at New Voice Media. Before I get into the kind of meat of the talk, I'll just clarify the difference between continuous delivery and continuous deployment, as I found the terms can be confusing. So in a nutshell, continuous delivery is an extension of continuous integration, where you release your changes to production quickly and sustainably at the press of a button. And that press of a button is important. It's a business decision to release to production rather than an automatic deployment thing. So you may choose not to deploy a viable kit that's passed all its tests and checks. Whereas continuous deployment takes that a step further. Code changes that are committed and pass all the automated checks are also automatically deployed to production. Now, when I was doing this work, we weren't at a continuous deployment phase. We were trying to get to continuous delivery. And so today, I'm not going to talk about the technical side of our release process. I want to concentrate on the human and communication side of things. As for us at the time, improving those made a real tangible difference to our release cycle time and our release processes. So why did we even want to improve our release process? And the problem we had was we had a 4.5-day release cycle. Now that's not a problem if you don't need to release often. Maybe weekly or monthly is okay for you in your context, but we did want to release more often. And that was because we wanted faster feedback than we were getting from our customers on our feature work. We wanted to be able to roll forwards for bug fixes rather than backwards. And we wanted to be able to respond urgently to business needs that cropped up, urgent business needs that cropped up. Also, our product, because our product was telephony systems for call centers, our customers noticed problems really, really quickly, and they would be on the phone to us the minute anything went wrong. So we needed to be able to respond quickly to anything that did crop up. At the time, we were a monolith code base with multiple development teams checking in every day as well. So it wasn't microservices architecture. So we were trying to coordinate multiple teams and all their work into one code base and release that out. But basically, we wanted to be able to release on demand, whatever cadence we chose, and a week to pick and verify a kit was just too long for us. So why did we have such a long release cycle? Why was it 4.5 days? One of the reasons was it took 2 people, at the time it took 2 people 60 hours a week to manually build out the web farms with the new release candidate. And that was getting longer as we scaled up. That was stressful for them to do that, as there was always the possibility of making a mistake that could impact our customers. So obviously automating building out the web farms was important, and we did that. And that was some of the technical work we did. But we had other problems, though, that would become bottlenecks once those web farm builds were automated. And that's what we're going to talk about today. And that's the people and communication side of things and the problems we have with those and how we solved them. Another problem we had was a lack of trust in the release process from a few of our customers. So we had to have a staff member on site for one of our customers for every single release every week. So that meant every week either asking one of our sales reps who was going to be close to the customer's site to attend that release, or sending someone from our office up to the client's site, which was 50 miles away. So obviously that is not a great situation, and that's a big constraint for getting faster as we wanted to. But we also had a bit of a trust problem in the release process ourselves. So we purposely timed our releases to avoid the customer's normal office hours. And that was because we were worried that deploying a new kit would impact telephone calls already in play on our platform. So for the UK, that meant 8 p.m. in the evening releases, and that's not scalable while we still needed quite a few people to support the release. It wasn't so bad for like the US and APAC because their office, out of their office hours was in our daytime hours, so that wasn't too bad. But for the UK, it did mean evening releases, and that wasn't scalable as we got faster, as we wanted to get faster. We also had pipeline test problems, which is quite a common thing, I think. So we had a lot of automated tests, which were helpful and a necessity for continuous integration, but we did have a problem with them. They were a bit flaky, meaning we had a lot of false negatives. tests that failed for no apparent reason. So this being a monolith, there was code there from years and years back. So some of the tests were new and very well written. Some of them were pretty old, and the platform had changed in the meantime. So we did have some flaky test problems. But that led to mistrust in the automated test suite, and that also added time to the release cycle because people had to investigate those failures to confirm whether the kit is okay to release or not. Releasing our software. So another problem was releasing our software was actually a costly business because the overall process involved a lot of people over those 4.5 days. There was still a lot of manual parts to it. And that converts to money and people's time that could have been spent on developing new features or other valuable work. In other words, it was slowing down our ability to work on value demand. We didn't really know how costly, though. We just knew that it was more costly than we were comfortable with. Other than automating the build of the web farms, we didn't really know what the next most important thing to fix in our release process was. We knew we had some problems, but we didn't really know, and we didn't have facts to work from. We were just guessing as to what they were. So what did I do? At the time, I was an exploratory software tester on a cross-functional development team, and the management asked me to work on improving our release process alongside my testing work. So I knew that I didn't know what to focus on first. So I did what I'm sure many of you would have too. I observed the system in action, observed the releases while they were happening. I measured some stuff and I analysed what I'd measured. And I published some stats to the rest of the department showing what I'd learned about the release process. And from that point, we could then pick what seemed like the most pressing problem to fix and run the first experiment to try and make things better. So that's all, I think, a fairly standard approach. So one of the first things I did was observe the release support process over time to see what was actually happening, get a baseline. So I sat in on every release for a month or two and just watched. In practical terms, this meant joining the release support HipChat room and just watching the conversation rather than participating in it. We were using HipChat because we had teams in Poland and teams in the UK. And within the UK, we had, some people would be in the office and some people were at home. So we were catering for kind of remote facilitation and communication. That meant I observed 6 deploys a week to our US, APAC and EMEA clouds over a couple of months. So I was able to see, because I was watching them all, I was able to see patterns and identify problems. Now, observation sounds easy, you just observe and watch what happens and learn from what you've seen. But in practice, it's not that easy because your own preconceived ideas and biases get in the way. And this is where I mentioned before the talk, I trained as a Montessori nursery school teacher. And this is where it really helped because as part of your Montessori training, you're taught how to objectively observe in order to make accurate assessments without judgment. In the Montessori context, it's obviously about observing children's development. But in the release instance, that training enabled me to objectively observe without bringing in my biases and just watch what was actually happening. I can't encourage you enough to practice observation skills. It's really, really key to a lot of things, I think, in our industry. We didn't have any data on our release processes, so that was another first step, was to collect some actual data. So I didn't know exactly what I wanted to measure or what would be useful to measure, so I measured everything I could think of to start with and then just dropped things over time that weren't useful. But at the time, we were producing 2 potentially releasable kits a day. So I took the time that the build with all our end-to-end tests were due to start as the beginning of the cycle, and the time it was deployed to the last production cloud as the end of the cycle. And to record that data, I just set up a basic Excel spreadsheet with columns for each step of the process. And I recorded things like the start and end times for each step of the process, the number of people involved in those steps, the status of each kit as it went through, the reason the automated test failed, if they did, and how far each kit got along in our pipeline, whether it made it all the way or whether it failed at regression testing or something like that. And so I hadn't heard of value stream mapping at the time, but in effect, that's exactly what I was doing here in a spreadsheet form. And this data that I collected in the spreadsheet was the driver for identifying our communication and misconception problems, which I'll talk about in a moment. The next step, so we've observed and we've measured some stuff. So the next step was analysing that objective data I'd collected. And because I'd collected the start and end times for each step of the process, I was able to calculate how long each step took and identify our bottlenecks and queues from that. And what the data showed was that we spent a lot of time waiting for the next step in the process to happen, longer than the actual processes themselves took. So we had much longer queues than we realised. And that's effectively dead time. That's just bulking out the release cycle. Because I'd collected the data on a number of people involved in certain steps and how long those steps took, I was also able to show the cost of the release process. And that was really helpful in getting management to sit up and take notice and get their buy-in to fix some of this stuff. So having all that data was great. I'd collected all that stuff, learned a lot, but there was one problem. I was the only one seeing that information. So in order for any real change to happen, I had to get people engaged in the problems and wanting to fix those problems as well. And that meant getting people to see that it wasn't just the lack of an automated pipeline to production that was causing the 4.5 days release cycle time. It was their own behaviours, and that was also contributing to the delays. And that was quite hard to do. It required a bit of diplomacy. And I'll talk about some of those behaviours soon. One of the great things about working with technologists and knowledge workers like, developers and testers and the ops people is that they really like data and facts. And publishing the stats I'd gathered started conversations within the department and got people's interest into how to fix some of those problems. And it focused people on what our next steps would be for improving the release process. So what did I learn from all this observing and measuring and analysing? As interesting as it was, I had to do something with it. So I learned three main things. There were other things, but these were the three main things. The first one's obvious. Building web farms manually means we could only release once a week maximum. We already knew that, and the data proved that that work was going to happen to automate that pipeline. Next one was that people's perceptions and poor communication was literally causing hours of delays that were nothing to do with tech and pipelines. And the third one was a really interesting one, was that the reality did not match people's perceptions. And this I found through a bit of the data, but also really talking to developers, talking to testers, talking to whoever was involved in the process, and talking to management as well about what their perceptions of our process was. Now I just want to run you through some of the kind of perceptions that had cropped up and what we did about them, and whether they were true and what we did about them. So first one was that broken builds were holding up testing. So the exploratory testers, and myself included, because I was an exploratory tester at the time, we believed that the developers weren't fixing the broken builds quickly enough, and that was blocking our ability to finish our testing and our stories and the staging environment, which we needed to use at the time. For various reasons. So we kind of felt it was on them. The reality though was that we were ignoring most of the green builds, that we were ignoring more green builds than we were actually developing to our staging environment. So that was a really sobering thought. And I'll just show you some of the data on that that we found. So this is the data from the first 3 months of observations that I did. So the stats that I collected showed that we produced 70 kits in the first 3 months of measuring our process, but we only progressed 30% of those to our staging environment. The rest didn't get anywhere. So 70% of them didn't get any further in the pipeline other than that initial build. 34% though were green and usable. So this here were green and usable kits, but we didn't deploy them at all. We just ignored them. So we wasted them basically. We were wasting more builds than we were actually deploying. And the other 36% were left unconfirmed. And what that meant for us, unconfirmed for us, meant at least one automated check had failed somewhere, either in the continuous integration tests or the end-to-end tests, but we hadn't investigated it. So the effect of this was longer feedback loops and longer story cycle times as teams waited longer to complete testing. But also, in these ones that did eventually go green, we're spending time investigating those. So to get more of our green kits deployed to staging based on this data, what we did was we immediately started a temporary deployment rota. So deployments to staging at that time were manual, and the testers were responsible for doing it. So we set up a rota to take turns at deploying kits to staging. In the meantime, and in parallel with that, we worked on getting those deploys automated. That was the ultimate, and then we could get rid of the rota. So that helped a lot. So another perception that I found from talking to people was that our automated checks were a bit flaky. So we had thousands of automated tests in our pipeline, and they formed the backbone of our regression checking. And our perception was they were a bit flaky, and we had quite a lot of false negatives. The reality was actually they were a lot flaky. They were flakier than we realized. So developers and testers were spending time every day rerunning the test to work out whether the test failure was genuine or not. And often it was the same test being giving false negatives time and time again, over the weeks. Again, this meant longer feedback loops, less trust in our automated tests, and time added to our release cycles. So looking at the data for that, we were already, we had a lot of tests, so we wanted to work out which were the most important ones to work on first that would help improve our situation the most. So we were already categorizing the reasons for why the test failed. We just had codes, and we were recording that. So we're digging into those. What the stats showed was that 50%, this chunk here, of the automated check failures were because of flaky tests, not because of any other reason. Those tests would run, they would fail, and you ran them again and they would pass. So, how do you know which is the correct result? Was the pass correct or the fail correct? And that is what was a big contribution to the distrust of the automated test suite, and of course, impacting feedback loops again. So these stats here, particularly this flaky, 50% flaky test stats, that led to management giving teams time to fix the worst performing tests to improve the automation suite and shorten those feedback loops as a kind of one-off kickstart project. Let's just get some of those out the way, and then let's work on our process to make sure we're giving tests the attention they need as a regular, just normal part of work afterwards. Another perception was that regression testing involved 5 to 6 people for 2 hours a week. Now we had, as I mentioned, we've got thousands of automated tests, and they form the backbone of our regression testing. But on top of that, we did do some exploratory testing on the release candidate in our regression pre-production area. And our perception was that took 5 to 6 people 2 hours to complete, so 10 to 12 person hours a week. Now, quite shockingly, the reality was it took 6 to 8 people up to 2 days to complete, which is a much, much, much more costly affair. And that actually shocked all of us. So looking at this chart here, kind of shows in a graphical form those numbers. So the blue is what we thought was happening, the perception, and the orange is the reality. But because our perceptions were so wrong, we'd really underestimated how much regression testing was costing us in time and money. And once the web farm builds were automated, regression testing was really going to be a bottleneck. So we had to do something about it. And you can see here the cost an hour was we thought it was 10 to 12 person hours a week, but actually it was like between 96 and 128 person hours a week. There's a big difference. So these stats triggered a project led by some of the exploratory testers to review and refine the manual regression checks that we do. And the result of that is now that regression testing takes 1 to 2 people between half an hour and 3 hours a week, sometimes more if there's a few problems to investigate. So that was a big win for us. Another perception that was people had was that someone in the development focused side of the release team, we had a virtual release team coordinating releases, that they would select a release candidate for the week, and the ops focused people who were going to deploy that candidate to the regression pre-production testing environment felt that we were really slow on picking that release candidate, that we took ages to do that. The reality, though, when I spoke to people, was that there was a lot of urgent must be in the kit changes cropping up at the last minute. That meant we had to delay and wait for those code changes to be committed. And these delays would be anything from an hour to a day. And they also tended to increase the number of defects and urgent patches to fix those defects as the changes were being rushed through. So it was affecting quality. And as a result of this, the stats highlighting this, we made some changes to how we tracked release commitments and just took a long, hard look at if each change that was trying to be rushed and really did need to delay the release candidate or not. And that was quite hard and involved difficult conversations with teams and product owners. Because they kind of, they may have felt that we were trying to block them when actually we weren't. We were just trying to stabilize the releases. One of the side effects of this particular problem was that whenever we rushed a change through, there would often be knock-on effects on the next release cycle, or even the second one after that, because of the reduced quality from rushing and the number of patches and things that we would have to do. So it was quite an important one to focus on. To help us with this, we introduced a simple Trello board that all the teams could add their release commitments to. And these commitments were different to a Jira story or an epic being finished. It was what code has been committed that absolutely must be deployed live this week. So we had to make sure we got those in, but anything else could wait. We also questioned whether the commitment absolutely had to be in or could it wait, which sounds counterintuitive. Because we're not trying to slow things down, as I mentioned, but we're trying to reduce the stress and the amount of rushed work that actually led to higher failure demand and rework levels. So that was our main aim with this one. But when we looked at it, the underlying reason that people were feeling this urgency to get a code change in was because we could only release once a week. So they felt if we didn't get it in this week, they were really missing out. So that kind of highlighted the need for us to be able to release more frequently. But the main aim of working on this particular perception was to stabilize it so that we could then release more than once a week. Another perception that we had was that the ops people who were deploying the release candidate to our pre-production environment, the more dev-focused people on working on this, felt that they took a long time to do that. The reality, though, was that the ops people had actually set aside specific time in the morning to do it for us. However, because we took a long time to select the release candidate, as I've just talked about, we missed that slot and they'd moved on to other work, or they were in meetings, or they were at lunch, or whatever. But also, we were communicating via email. We'd send them the kit number of the selected release candidate, and job done. We've communicated, so it all should happen quickly, right? Because we've told them which one we want. And that leads me on to the next perception that had a big part to play. And that was the perception was that handovers were happening quickly, that we were communicating well and handing over to the next person in the process quite quickly. Whereas the reality was that email handovers were adding hours and hours to our release cycle. It turned out to be between half a day to our release cycle just because of email. And to quote Rob Lambert, who was a colleague of mine at the time, communication is in the air of the listener. You haven't communicated until the recipient of your message has understood it. And sending an email and not following it up just doesn't cut it. So people would be sending an email to hand over to the next person in the process, and that person would be just not available or only check their emails at a specific time of day. So we needed to do something about handovers, with ultimately trying to get rid of them altogether. So to do that, we needed to change habits, and changing habits is hard. Habits become ingrained. That's why they're habits, and they're an automatic response. So changing them requires effort and persistence. And the people coordinating the release were a virtual team, but we weren't working as a team, even though we're in an open plan office and could easily speak to each other. It just wasn't happening. And most importantly, at the beginning here, I wanted to create a sense of urgency, a feeling that the release going out is the most important thing to work on. And it's that idea of getting completed work into production trumps starting anything new. Get the work that we've spent time and effort doing, get that value out to the customer as soon as possible rather than working on something else. We needed to start talking to each other. We needed to eliminate that time wasted waiting for people to read the email handovers. And we needed to feel engaged and get that sense of ownership. the data that we were sharing, or the stats data that we were sharing, meant people began to see the effects of their actions on the release process and how their poor communication affected the next person's ability to do their part. And that was really important. It also made people want to make it better. So sharing that data was a key part. Not just sharing the data, but sharing the data and the impact it was having was a key part of making people feel engaged and wanting to help make it better. If you're interested in learning about changing habits, I can really recommend Helen Mizwoski's Building Better Agile Habits workshop and her blogs about it. I've learned a lot from her about changing teams and people's habits, which I put into practice for all of this. So what we did, we had to change that perception that seeing an email absolved you of responsibility and that your part in the process was done. So we banned those email handovers altogether, and we looked for other ways to let the next person know it was their turn to do something. Because remember, there was still quite a lot of manual steps in our release process at this point. And we looked for ways, instead of doing the email, we looked for ways to physically hand over instead. And this was a temporary thing to build better communication habits. So one of my colleagues, Gemma, came up with the Hollywood Clacker idea. So the Hollywood Clacker is the board they use when they're filming movies. So we went and bought one, and we wrote the release candidate number on the clacker like you would a film name. So whoever had the clacker, it was your turn to do something. After you'd done your bit of work, you physically handed it over to the next person in the process, like a baton in a relay race. And it worked. And after a while, we didn't need it anymore. And it worked because it was gimmicky and it was fun. It got people out of their desks and actually talking to their colleagues, which in turn built relationships. It made us laugh, which really helps build relationships. And those better relationships then turned into mutual respect and the feeling that you're working for a common cause. And that was really important. Along with the Hollywood Clacker, we set up a physical Kanban board. It was one of those mobile boards on wheels, in the same way that you would for any other team. And the point was, as with any Kanban board, was to visualize the flow and what stage we were at and who was doing the current bit of work. So we had columns for the main processes and magnets with our initials or avatars on. And what that also helped do was create a sense of responsibility and that sense of urgency that the release going out is the most important thing to work on for whoever's turn it was to do something. If your magnet was in play, it meant the release cycle was waiting for you to do something. And the release candidate couldn't progress any further until you'd done your bit. So that was also really effective. So what difference did all these investigations and observations, etc., and changes make? The data we had convinced management to allocate time to identify and fix the worst of the flaky tests as a kind of kickstart project, which I mentioned before. And the result of that was the automated test suite reliability improved and our feedback loop shortened, which helped speed up development and improve quality. So that was a really important one. Equally important, not spending time investigating broken builds also made the developers and testers happy. So that helped with kind of engagement and motivation as well. And then remember the data we looked at earlier that showed we were deploying less than half of the available green kits to our test staging area. We were only deploying 30%. As a result of that, we prioritized automating the deploys to our staging area. So now most of them reach there without any delay at all. Again, this helped shorten the feedback loops as we could finish the last bits of our testing and staging quicker. And it also shortened the feedback loops for the development teams themselves. Another benefit was a regression went from 5 to 8 people for up to 2 days to 1 person for around 30 minutes if there were no problems. Massive difference there. We also got rid of and greatly reduced our queues or our waiting times between the steps in the release process. Now, what I mean by queues is think of it like an in tray on your desk. Nothing's happening, nobody's working on anything, it's just waiting for somebody to do something. So because we could identify those, we worked on getting rid of them, and that just naturally brought our cycle times down. So the combination of everything we did was that the release cycle reduced from 4.5 days down to one or 2 days. 2 days comfortably at the time, 1 day if we pushed ourselves. We were now at a point where we could do 2 releases a week if we wanted to, just from working on people and communication related issues. So just to kind of summarize, I just got a list here of some top tips. If you are interested in having a look at your own processes or think this might benefit you as well. So some of the things I'd recommend is, first step, go and see, go and watch, go and observe objectively as you can. It's Gemba basically. Really, really important to get that baseline. Listen actively, if you learn how to listen actively. It's a bit harder than you think, but that's where that's where I identified all these perceptions that people had and how they weren't real. So I could identify the perception and then prove it wasn't real with the data. Measure effectively. Again, that's about collecting the data and having it in some form, whether it's an Excel spreadsheet or whatever works for you, helps you spot those cues. And that then allows you to raise awareness with the appropriate people with facts. Learn about effective communication. The entire 90% of this work was really about people communicating with each other about various things. So learning about effective communication was really key. One resource I can recommend that I used myself was Rob Lambert's communication workshop. I learned an awful lot about communication from that. I believe he still runs it publicly now, so it's available. Really, it's one of the most effective workshops I've ever done in my career. I learn about habits and how they form and how you change them, another key thing, and be creative to change those habits. So the idea of the Hollywood clacker, that came from one person. I hadn't thought of that myself, but it was really, really effective, so think out of the box a bit, look for fun stuff that helps people get engaged and ask for help, engage people. I certainly didn't have all the good ideas. I could collect data and I could analyze it, but I certainly didn't have all the ideas on how to fix it. I definitely needed people's help with that. And as usual, celebrate the successes, whether that's a show and tell or blog post or a beer in the pub or whatever. Make it known to everybody what the impacts of their changes and their efforts are, that it is working, that it's helping. And number 10 is just get familiar with some of the techniques if you're not already. Things like value stream mapping, the Toyota Kata, the Kanban boards, the Go-Sees, all of these things, these techniques combined all really helped us identify and then fix some of these problems that we had. So that about covers it. And if you are interested in keeping in touch or want to ask me anything out, that you've forgotten to ask, there's my kind of Twitter, LinkedIn, and I've got a website there that you can also contact me on. So just if anyone's got any questions, I'd be happy to answer.